In the summer of 1366, the Thames River was a silent witness to a king's fading glory. King Edward III, once a vibrant and powerful ruler, now moved with the slow, laborious steps of a man whose body and spirit were both failing. His royal barge, a symbol of his majesty and command, glided smoothly along the water, carrying him to Windsor Castle. But the king's heart was heavy, and his mind was preoccupied with the shadows that loomed over his reign. Edward's health had taken a turn for the worse, and he was no longer the robust warrior he once was. His movements were now confined to the areas near the river, and he often spent long periods in quiet seclusion at his hunting lodges in the New Forest. The king's physician made frequent visits, bringing medicines from the apothecary to ease his suffering. But even more concerning was the condition of his beloved wife, Queen Philippa. Philippa's health had been declining for years, ever since a terrible fall from a horse while hunting with Edward in 1358. The injury she sustained had never fully healed, and by 1365, her suffering was so great that she could hardly travel except by barge or litter. Her illness was so severe that she had begun making preparations for her tomb, a task that no one wants to undertake while still alive. The king, deeply devoted to his wife, was torn between his own declining health and the need to be by her side. But it was not just the king's health and his wife's illness that were changing the course of his life. A new and unexpected presence had entered the royal court, and it would soon alter everything. One of Philippa's ladies-in-waiting, a young woman named Alice Purrs, caught the king's attention. Alice had a seductive voice and a charm that was hard to resist. She was not just another face in the crowd. She was a woman who knew how to keep the king's interest. In 1364, Alice Purrs gave birth to a child, the king's first known illegitimate offspring. The news spread like wildfire through the court, and whispers of scandal followed. Alice was sent away to give birth, perhaps in Norfolk, and returned to court with a son named John of Southeray. The king, despite his failing health and the impending loss of his wife, could not ignore the young woman. He showered her with gifts and grants, and she began to establish a foothold in the court. Edward's relationship with Alice Purrs was a stark contrast to his earlier years, when he had been a faithful husband to Philippa. He had always been a man of strong principles, and his court was known for its strict moral standards. But now, with Philippa's health failing, Edward's resolve weakened. He allowed Alice to come and go from the court, and she bore him 2 more children. This was a significant departure from the norms of the time, and it marked a new chapter in the king's life. As the king's health continued to decline, he faced another series of losses. His sister Joan died in September 1362, just 2 months before his jubilee. His daughter-in-law, Elizabeth de Burgh, also passed away the following year. The Knights of the Garter, his closest companions and allies, began to die off one by one. The castle on the Isle of Sheppey, which he had built as a testament to his military vision, stood as a lonely reminder of the friends he had lost. He dedicated the castle to Philippa and named the town and castle Queenborough in her honor, but the joy of the dedication was marred by the absence of those who had shared his dream. The most significant loss, however, was the death of King John of France in April 1364. John had returned to England to pay his ransom, but fell ill and died before he could formally renounce his sovereignty over the territories agreed upon in the Treaty of Bretigny. This left a vacuum of power in France, and the new king, Charles V, was reluctant to honor the treaty. The political landscape was shifting, and Edward found himself struggling to maintain the gains he had fought so hard to achieve. In the midst of these challenges, Edward's son, the Black Prince, faced a crisis of his own. In 1365, the French hit upon a strategy to use English mercenaries against their own ally, King Pedro of Castile. The prince, with Edward's approval, led a mission to reinstate Pedro, but the campaign was a financial disaster. The prince's army won a great victory at Nájera in 1367, but the cost was astronomical, and Pedro's brutal treatment of the prisoners created more enemies than allies. The crisis in Gascony was deepening, and the prince's debts were mounting. Edward, now more a figurehead than an active ruler, could only watch as his son's principality teetered on the brink of collapse. The stage was set for a new phase of the 100 Years' War, and the king, once a master of strategy, was now a passive observer. In May 1368, Edward attended Parliament, a shadow of his former self. He showered the representatives with praise, but the statutes passed were without a clear strategy. The king's mind was preoccupied with the impending loss of his wife and the decline of his own health. As the summer sun set over Windsor Castle, the king's thoughts turned to the past, to the glory of his victories, and to the love of his life, Philippa. The end was near, and the king's world was changing, but the legacy of his reign would endure. After Parliament, King Edward realized how serious the situation had become. Until then, he had been hands-off about his son, the Prince of Wales, governing Gascony. The prince, after all, was the heir to the throne, and needed to learn how to handle tough political situations. Edward believed that stepping in would only hinder the prince's growth. But when King Charles of France agreed to intervene in Gascony, Edward had to act. He wrote a stern letter to Charles, demanding an explanation for accepting the appeal. Charles delayed his response, not wanting to spark a war. The prince knew the situation was bad. He ordered men at arms and archers to be raised on his estates in England and Wales, preparing for war. Charles then took things a step further, summoning the prince to appear in Paris in May 1369. Edward, thinking his son wasn't fit to govern, wrote to him, but the prince defended himself against his father's advisors, who accused him of mismanagement and bringing dishonor to the family. However, the prince was not only facing political challenges, but also a serious illness he had caught in Castile. He was too weak to lead an army, even though he wrote to Paris saying he would come with a helmet on his head and 60,000 men at his back. The news of the prince's illness was another blow to Edward, who was already struggling. He and his wife, Philippa, were sick, and in September he learned that his daughter-in-law Blanche, the last surviving child of the Duke of Lancaster and wife of John of Gaunt, had died. The realization that war was imminent, and the illness of his once proud son added to his despair. Then came more bad news. Lionel, his second son, was dead. Lionel had been in Italy, where he had just married the daughter of Galeazzo Visconti, the Lord of Milan. The poet Petrarch had even praised the prince, and now he was gone. Edward was asked where he wanted Lionel to be buried. Struggling with these losses, Edward, who was old and ill, began to cut back on spending. He dismissed many members of his household, and work on royal buildings stopped. The great palaces, once filled with the echoes of his victories, now stood silent and empty. At Windsor, the Christmas of 1368 was somber. The sun shone through the glass, lighting up the newly painted walls, but there was no joy or celebration. The king's mind, however, was still focused on the coming war. He gathered his closest advisors, including his sons John and Edmund, and the Earls of Salisbury, Warwick, and Oxford, to discuss their strategy. Edward's health fluctuated, but he remained determined to lead his country through the crisis. Parliament was summoned to Westminster, and on June 3rd, Edward asked for their support in resuming the title of King of France and making war on Charles de Valois. The representatives agreed unanimously. Taxation for the war was approved, and Edward wrote to the prince that he had reclaimed the title and would invade to reclaim his right. Ships were seized, archers were selected, and men were readied for battle. However, before the army could set out, Edward received a message from Philippa. She was near death and wanted him by her side. Philippa had been a constant source of strength and support for Edward. When he arrived at Windsor, she extended her hand and made 3 final requests: to pay her debts, to fulfill her bequests to churches and her servants, and to be buried beside her at Westminster. Edward, in tears, promised to honor her wishes. Philippa passed away on August 15th, and Edward and their youngest son, Thomas, were with her. The invasion of France was put on hold as Edward mourned the loss of his beloved wife. The next few months brought more tragedy. Sir Robert Ufford, the Earl of Suffolk, died on November 4th. The harvest was the worst in half a century, and the plague returned. On November 13th, the Earl of Warwick died, and Edward was left with few friends and companions. He had outlived many of the people who had once surrounded him, and the weight of his losses was heavy. Philippa's funeral was a somber affair, and Edward prepared for it with great care. He could not lead the army himself, and sent his retinue to join John at Calais. John, worried about his father, returned to England by mid-December, spending Christmas with Edward at King's Langley. They were then rowed down the river to the Tower of London, where Philippa's embalmed body arrived from Windsor on January 3rd. The funeral solemnities lasted 6 days, but for Edward, the grief seemed unending. By 1370, Edward's life was filled with memories of past glories, but the present was bleak. He was an old, sick man, a shadow of his former self. His friends were gone, and he withdrew from public life, spending time alone with a few close companions. He issued instructions through a private secretary and became distant from the court. His only confidants were his sons, the Prince and John of Gaunt, but the prince was in Gascony, and John was cautious in his interactions with his father. In this atmosphere of isolation, Edward's relationship with his mistress, Alice Pers, grew stronger. She became his principal advisor, and her influence over him increased. Edward's dependence on her for both companionship and advice made him vulnerable, and their relationship became the subject of gossip at court. Despite his personal struggles, Edward focused on renewing the war in France. In April 1370, he ordered John of Gaunt to take an army to Gascony to support the prince. Simultaneously, Sir Robert Knowles was ordered to attack from Calais. The strategy was similar to what Edward had used in the past, a double attack from the north and the south. Knowles landed at Calais in July with over 4,000 men and began a destructive campaign, burning and looting towns. However, King Charles of France had learned from past mistakes and avoided direct conflict, allowing the English to ravage the countryside without a decisive battle. The campaign in the south, led by John of Gaunt, was more successful. Gaunt met the prince in Gascony, only to find him bedridden. Despite his illness, the prince was enraged when the Bishop of Limoges defected to the French. He was carried in a litter to Limoges and launched a brutal attack, capturing the city and looting it. The bishop and other leaders were brought to the prince in chains, and the city was destroyed, but the victory was short-lived. The prince's health deteriorated, and he had to return to Bordeaux. There he learned that his son and heir, Edward of Angoulême, had died. Distraught, the prince prepared to return to England with his wife and remaining son, Richard of Bordeaux, leaving John of Gaunt to manage the remaining affairs in Gascony. Edward III faced tough times in 1370. He had always been a strong and capable leader, but now he found himself struggling. The war in France was not going well, and Gascony, a region he had fought hard to keep, was slipping away. Edward had done his best, but he couldn't be everywhere at once. He had appointed the best men he could find, but even they couldn't stop the French from taking back what Edward had won. The main problem was that the English were now on the defensive. For years, Edward had been the one attacking, pushing the French back, but now the roles were reversed. The French were coming for him, and his lands were at risk. Edward's best commanders were getting old and tired, and he himself was not as strong as he used to be. Even though his son, the Black Prince, had won a battle at Limoges, the French quickly reclaimed most of Gascony. It was a tough blow for Edward. In February 1371, Edward had to face an angry parliament. They hadn't met in over a year, and they were not happy. They wanted to know why their money and efforts had led to such failures. The loss of Gascony and the failure of the Northern Army were major setbacks. The representatives were worried about a French invasion and demanded answers. Edward tried to defend himself, but the mood was hostile. The blame fell on his ministers, many of whom were clergymen. The Parliament demanded that these clerics be dismissed, and Edward, feeling the pressure, had no choice but to agree. The new men Edward appointed were younger and less experienced. Some, like William Latimer, were corrupt and took advantage of their positions. They lent money to Edward at high interest rates, kept the profits, and returned the original sums to the treasury. This kind of behavior reminded people of the corrupt officials of the past, and it didn't take long for the government to fall back into chaos. Despite the setbacks, Edward's son, the Black Prince, returned to England in April 1371. It was a bittersweet reunion. Both father and son were in poor health, but their love and respect for each other remained strong. The prince's presence gave Edward a boost, and he started to regain some of his confidence. He took action against William Windsor, who was mismanaging Ireland, and at a council meeting in Winchester, he showed a firmer hand in dealing with Parliament's demands. Edward was determined to maintain his authority, even if it meant standing his ground against the growing unrest. However, 1372 brought more bad news. The deaths of key figures like Sir Walter Manny and the Earls of Stafford and Hereford weakened Edward's position. John of Gaunt, Edward's son, faced criticism for his ambitions and his relationship with Catherine wrote. Diplomatic efforts also failed, and the English suffered more losses in Gascony. The worst blow came in June when the English fleet was destroyed off La Rochelle. This was the first major defeat of Edward's reign, and it shattered the myth of English invincibility. Edward was devastated but determined. He vowed to lead a powerful army to France and fight until he regained what he had lost or died trying. Plans were made for an expedition, and Edward gathered his forces. But the weather turned against him, and his physical condition, along with that of his son, made it impossible to sail. After weeks of delays, Edward was forced to call off the campaign. His world was falling apart, and there was little he could do. The war in France continued to go badly. The French, under Du Guesclin, steadily took back English-held territories. By the time peace negotiations began in Bruges in 1375, Edward's control over Gascony was smaller than it had been when he inherited it from his father. The years of struggle had taken their toll, and Edward's once glorious reign was coming to a difficult end. Edward, once the mighty King of England, had seen better days. In his prime, he was a formidable leader, a conqueror, and a lawmaker, but as he aged, his strength and influence waned. At 60, he was more a symbol of the past than a visionary for the future. The young nobles saw him as an old, retired soldier, a man who had done his part but whose time had passed. Edward's eldest sons, the Prince and John, also felt the weight of the kingdom's decline. The prince, once a great warrior, was now too ill to lead the English forces in Gascony. In 1372, he publicly gave up his claim to the Principality of Aquitaine, a sign of how much things had changed. John, on the other hand, remained optimistic about the English cause in France and his own ambitions in Castile. However, he lacked the military skill to turn the tide. In 1373, he led a daring march across France from Calais to Bordeaux, but it was a disaster. His army, exhausted and undernourished, was on the brink of collapse. By the time they reached Bordeaux, they were in no shape to fight. By 1374, the English had lost almost all their territories in France, with only Bayonne, Bordeaux, a few castles in Brittany, and the fortress of Calais still in their hands. Edward appointed his son Edmund and the Duke of Brittany as his lieutenants, but it was clear that the war was lost. The English military machine needed a strong, active king to lead it, and without Edward, a defensive war was doomed to fail. As the years passed, Edward's mental health declined. He was still able to issue instructions in 1374, such as rewarding Geoffrey Chaucer with a daily pitcher of wine. Chaucer, a great poet, had been sent on a mission to Italy by Edward and later became the controller of the customs. However, Edward's judgment was often weak. In 1373, he gave some of Philippa's jewels to Alice Purrs, his mistress, in a tactless and public manner. This was a clear sign of his declining mental state. He also ordered the repair of bridges in Oxfordshire because he wanted to go hawking there, showing that he was still issuing orders but could not foresee the consequences of his actions. By 1375, Edward was often described as an affable, forgetful old man. He still went hunting and received visitors, but he was no longer involved in the important business of the kingdom. William Latimer, the Chamberlain, controlled access to the king and even began to reply to petitions in Edward's name. Edward's weakness allowed people like Latimer and Alice Purrs to take advantage. Alice, in particular, used her influence to secure her future. She was intelligent and realized that her time in power was limited. She married William Windsor in secret, likely to ensure she had a protector after Edward's death. The good Parliament met in 1376, and Edward did not attend, except for the opening ceremony. His absence was notable, and the Parliament's debates centered around the state of the kingdom. John of Gaunt represented the royal family, but it was clear that the old king's time was nearly over. Edward's world had shrunk to his immediate surroundings, and he was conscious only of Alice, his household, and his few remaining family members. With them, he enjoyed hunting, hawking, and courtly entertainment. The once great king was now a shadow of his former self, living out his final days in a world he could no longer control. The end of Edward III's reign was filled with ironies and contradictions. The Commons, led by Sir Peter de la Mare, the first Speaker of the House of Commons, took a bold stand against the king. De la Mare, who was the steward of Edmund Mortimer, a descendant of the man who had once been a rival to Edward, now accused the king of adultery and poor leadership. The word coven, which Edward had used to describe the traitors of the past, was now used against his own advisers. It was as if the roles had reversed. The judge had become the criminal, and the criminal's heir had become the judge. The Commons had a strong position because the Bruges Treaty only provided a year-long truce in the war with France. Without more taxes, England couldn't send an army to France. When the Commons refused to grant the subsidy, they held all the cards. John of Gaunt, the king's son, was furious and threatened to crush the rebels. But he had to be careful because de la Mare had the protection of the Earl of March, who was now part of the royal family. The Earl's son, Roger Mortimer, was a potential claimant to the throne, which made Gaunt think twice about his actions. De la Mare's courage was remarkable. Despite threats and John of Gaunt's anger, he accused the king's advisers, Latimer and Richard Lyons, of a range of crimes, including embezzlement and extortion. The Commons demanded their dismissal, and even their execution. Gaunt couldn't ignore these charges, so he ordered an adjournment. Lyons tried to bribe the Prince of Wales, who was ill and close to death, but the prince refused the bribe. The king, however, accepted the gold, saying it was only what was rightfully his. Edward III was largely unaware of what was happening at Westminster. When Lord Neville, his steward, tried to defend Latimer, de la Mare shut him down with a warning. The king only learned about the charges when Latimer and Neville were dismissed, arrested, and had their possessions confiscated. Richard Sturry, one of the king's knights, told Edward that Parliament was trying to depose him, just as they had deposed his father. This news terrified Edward, who had always feared dishonor and losing the throne. He was further distressed when Alice, his mistress, was implicated in the accusations. Edward's distress grew when he learned that his son, the Prince of Wales, was dying. He rushed to see him at Kennington, but it was too late. The prince made his will, asking Edward to confirm his gifts, pay his debts, and protect his young son, Richard. Edward agreed, and the prince died the next day. The nation mourned, and Edward was left devastated, having lost his son and heir. Parliament then turned its attention to Alice, Edward's mistress. They accused her of taking money from the royal treasury and secretly marrying William Windsor. The king was shocked. He had been committing adultery without knowing it. He begged Parliament to show her mercy and not execute her. He also wanted Windsor prosecuted. Edward's grief and anger were overwhelming. To prevent future misrule, Parliament declared that a council of 12 should advise the king. Edward, however, was consumed by remorse and grief. He believed his son's death was a punishment for his treatment of his own father. He ordered the commemoration of the anniversaries of his mother and wife, Philippa. He cared little about the world around him, only waiting for two things: the burial of his son and his own death. In September, Edward fell ill at Havering. His doctors feared the worst, and letters were sent to the clergy asking for prayers for the king. On 5 October, the day of his son's funeral, Edward appointed trustees to manage his estates. He also ordered 57 cloths of gold to be offered at churches where his son's obsequies were being celebrated. That same day, he made his will, asking to be buried in Westminster Abbey. He provided funds for the completion of his religious foundations and the singing of masses for his and Philippa's souls. He confirmed Richard of Bordeaux as his heir and bequeathed him his best bed and other items. He also gave gifts to his daughter Joan and his daughter Isabella. However, he excluded his two youngest sons, Edmund and Thomas, from the main provisions of the will, likely out of bitterness over the good Parliament. As his end drew near, Edward was allowed some last wishes. Latimer and Alice were recalled and pardoned. The king received warm clothes to protect him from the cold, and Alice returned to his side. Despite her betrayal, Edward forgave her, and she received his pardon. In the end, Edward III, a king who had once been a symbol of strength and glory, passed away in a state of deep sorrow and regret. His reign, marked by great victories and achievements, ended with a sense of loss and disappointment. But his legacy lived on through his grandson, Richard, who would soon ascend the throne. Edward's story is a reminder that even the most powerful can fall from grace, and that the choices we make in life can have profound consequences.